First of all, thank you for that wonderful, warm welcome. I hope I can really give you a nice conversation. Now, I have a little physical challenge. I can't take a knee, but I'm gonna take this stool. Now, my presentation today is gonna deal with how music influences and is influenced by political movements and cultural mores. The title of my presentation, quickly, is The Cross-Pollination of Culture, Politics, and Art. And I see there's a lot of older people in there. That makes me more comfortable. And we can relate to political movements. I'm going to deal with the 50s, the 60s, and then move up into the mid-80s. The 70s wasn't really that happening for politics. Now, why is this important? Music is a unique art form. I mean, all art is special, but music is unique. First of all, it's the only art form I know that touches you, but you can't touch it. What do I mean by that? I can touch a piece of sculpture. I can touch a painting. I can touch a book of poetry. How do you touch a note? How do you touch sound? It runs through your body. It touches you, but you can't touch it. One thing about music also, we actually hear with 3 ears. The first ear is our mind. You know that music that you put on just so you can chill out and think? I might put on a little Miles or a little Coltrane. If I'm feeling particularly neurotic, I'll put on Stravinsky. Oh, some of y'all will get that later. But it's music that you just want to think. You don't want to do anything. The second ear that we hear with is the ear of the heart. There's nobody who's ever fallen out of love that didn't have a song, in some cases, a file of songs that you wanted to play over and over, and it just made you remember that pain, or remember the joy when you first fell in love. The third ear we hear with is the music and the sound of the body. That's the music that you hear to go, bam, you just want to dance. Now, as we move forward to make this connection between music and political movements, my frame of reference, to be clear today, is going to be about the African-American experience. We move into the 50s. Now, I always say this: society is the thermostat that sets the temperature. Art and artists are the thermometers that reflect it. Now, what's the political thermostat of the 50s? Racial segregation. Now, the first half of the 50s, we didn't really have a civil rights movement, but what we had as young black men and women was our heroes, and those heroes were basically jazz musicians. Now, there were many jazz musicians, but one name rose above all that combined culture, politics, and art, and that man's name was Miles Davis. Now, why is Miles so special? Miles Davis was the first black artist that said he refused to play in segregated clubs. Also, the very first interview Hugh Hefner wanted in his Playboy magazine, the first issue, is with Miles Davis. He said he didn't want to talk to anybody in the world but Miles Davis. A lot of you may remember in 1986 when Jack Nicholson won his Academy for As Good as It Gets. He holds it up and he said, "This is for Miles Davis." He affected the entire culture of art and politics and that development. Now, the second half of the 50s starts with 1955, December 6th, which is the beginning of what they call the Montgomery Bus Boycott that was organized by a dynamic young preacher named Martin Luther King. Now, here's what we have to get our heads around. The black community in Montgomery didn't catch a bus for 1 year. It started in December of 55, ended in December of 56. Now, we probably couldn't even get people in our neighborhood not to catch an Uber for a week. Imagine for an entire year, no one got on a bus. But what it led to, that was a tactic that led to the strategy of negotiating with the bus company in order to change the laws of Jim Crow down in the South. Now, as we move into the 60s, remember, the 50s doesn't really have protest movement. As we move into the 60s is very interesting. The first half of the 60s, the thermostat is on civil disobedience. Marches, sit-ins, bus rides. But it also begins the emergence of what we call the protest movement. And that music really starts with a great artist named Bob Dylan.
How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Now, why was that significant to us? Because the first line in that song says, how many roads must a man walk down before we call him a man? That was his homage to the civil rights marches. We all heard it. Also out of that time, there was a great artist named Sam Cooke who did a song called A Change Is Gonna Come. You had Curtis Mayfield who wrote Keep On Pushing. The High Priestess, Nina Simone, Young, Gifted, and Black. These songs were inspiring us as young African Americans. Now, the second half of the 60s takes a different turn. Something comes up called the Vietnam War. And now you have protest songs that are signifying the resistance of the younger generation to the war. There was a wonderful song by Edward Starr called War.
What is it good for? Absolutely. Now listen to me. I despise. 'Cause it means destruction of innocent life.
Now, this whole period of civil disruption started with the beginning of the 60s by the election of John F. Kennedy, who was a new voice. It was like Barack Obama before Barack. He wasn't black, but he had a great tan. And we were very hopeful at that time. Come 1963, August, there's an immense event called the March on Washington, out of which America becomes galvanized, because for the first time, they can see this in real time on television. They don't have to read about it. They don't have to listen to the radio. They see this. Out of that emerges Martin Luther King as the premier leader of the civil rights movement with his great speech, I Have a Dream. Fast forward, November of 63, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The country's thrown into chaos. Now we have the disruption of the assassination of Martin Luther King. In 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. Revolts break out all over America, over 100 cities. Chaos is ensuing. That's April of 68. Fast forward to June of 68 is the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. The 60s was almost like the decade of assassination. 65, you had the assassination of Malcolm X. And that's why I say part of the reason for the 70s not being that politically involved is that we kind of lost hope. The political movements died out. Those of you that were involved in all the protests across the college campuses, like as I was, I'm colorful, but I'm 71, you know what I mean? But the 70s, we kind of find that readjustment. Now, an interesting thing happens in the early 80s. What is the thermostat politically for the early 80s? Well, the thermostat for young black America is that there was no political movement. But for the first time, the music of that period inspired movement, not the other way around. And it started with a group called Grandmaster Flash. And it was a song called The Message. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. Then from there is the emergence of one of the most powerful and influential bands of the rest of the 80s and early 90s and going into 2000, a group called Public Enemy. And they had a song called fight the power.
89 the number, another summer. Sound of the funky drummer. Music hitting your heart, cause I know you got soul. Hey, listen if you're missing, y'all. Swinging while I'm singing. Giving what you're getting. Knowing what I knowin'. While the black band's sweating. In the rhythm I'm rolling. Gotta give us what we want. Gotta give us what we need. Our freedom of speech is freedom of death. We got to fight the powers that be. Fight the power. Fight the power. Fight the power.
Now, that inspires the whole generation of what we call the hip-hop generation. It's almost like the music inspired them to pursue. They began to pursue the idea of regenerating what we were doing in the 60s. I mean, young blacks and young whites, young Latinos and Asians. It was the spirit of revolution. Now, we're not talking about revolution like this, bow, bow, but revolution of the mind, revolution of the politics. And the music inspired the need for a movement. And that kind of culminated to the 1996 Million Man March. That brought in the youth. Now, where are we now? Like I said, I make my stuff short. I believe brevity is the soul of wit. Where are we now? I'm really interested to see where the music goes for this generation. Because, as I said, the thermostat is society, the temperature. What temperature are we dealing with now? What temperature is watching the Kavanaugh nominations? What temperature are we watching with two parties that are fighting each other and they'll rather burn the village down than try to communicate? We're in a very delicate period right now. You know, I say left wing or right wing. At a certain point now, it's starting to be on the same bird. Forget your political persuasion. But there's going to be a music that comes out of this. And my hope is that we're all there to inspire and absorb what the future brings. Whatever the future brings, it'll always be something that's next. Thank you.